I'd like to welcome you to the Australian National University this evening for this open forum on climate and climate change. The forum is sponsored by Toyota as a part of the Australian National University Toyota Public Lecture Series and from AMOS. My name is Clem Davis. I've been the coordinator of the conference. I'm also here at the visiting fellow at the Fenner School for the ANU, so I'm actually wearing two hats tonight. Just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures, which are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history, we celebrate. Now, the way the forum is going to operate, I'm only going to talk for a minute or so, then I'll pass it over to our chair, David Karoly. Each presenter will then spend a few minutes introducing themselves, talking about some of their experiences at Copenhagen, and then, after the introductions, we'll open up to questions from the floor. Very pleased to see the number of people here, and I hope we get a lot out of the conference. So I'll pass it over to David.
Thank you very much, Clem, and also thank you very much to the Australian National University and to the Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society for providing the opportunity to have this public lecture and public forum, which is titled, I believe, Climate and Climate Change, Ask an Expert. And obviously this group of hear nothing, see nothing, and do nothing monkeys are obviously the experts who will be seeking to answer your questions on climate and climate change. The forum, or the format, as Clem said, will be very much to allow the panel members to speak briefly, some of whom, the first three, were present at the Copenhagen Forum or discussions, the 17th Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention, and then two other members of the panel will be also reflecting on the Copenhagen Forum, and what are our opportunities and possibilities since then. We expect that to last for about 3/4 of an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for anyone who's interested in the audience to ask questions of the experts on any issues related to climate and climate change and the Copenhagen Conference. There are obviously a lot of questions that have been raised in the media and in newspapers, and the purpose of this forum is to allow you, as members of the general public, or as you participants in the National Conference of the Meteorological Society, to ask questions from a diverse group of experts, ranging from climate scientists to experts in sustainability, and even a representative of one of the countries at the Copenhagen Climate Forum. So without any more introduction, what I'd like to do is to hand over to our first panel member, who is Matt England. He's a professor in the Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. He was at Copenhagen, and in Copenhagen he was presenting some information on the latest climate change science through a document called the Copenhagen Diagnosis. So Matt.
Thanks, David, and thanks for getting the PowerPoint up and running. Yes, so as David mentioned, my involvement in Copenhagen was to go and present the Copenhagen Diagnosis, which I'll talk about in a minute. This report, and there's a website there, you can go and download this report from the website, free of charge. We have hard copies available as well to the enthusiasts in the room. But the report was compiled by 26 climate scientists from around the planet. And there's a list of names there of the authorship in alphabetical order. We chose an author group that could cover all of the science in the so-called Working Group 1 reports of the IPCC. And the reason we chose this group to span that area was that there was a sense among the authorship group that since the IPCC assessment report of 2007, that plenty of science had come along in the interim, and in particular, more observations had been made since the close-off of material for the IPCC report that justified a scientific update in time for the Copenhagen meeting. The 2007 IPCC report was a major undertaking by many, many authors. It took 5 or 6 years to put together, and there's no way we could match the scale of that report. It was 1,000 pages. Working Group 1 was about 1,000 pages long. Our document is about 65 pages long. It's written to be accessible to policymakers, the media, the general public, and the idea, as I said, was to update all of the science and observations that came about since the IPCC 2007 report. And I want to just spend the remaining 7 or 8 minutes that I have up here just to go through some of the messages that we found when reviewing all of the peer-reviewed science that was available to us over the last 3 or 4 years since the IPCC close-off. Now, the three major, I'll break down the diagnosis findings into 3 major areas. And the first major area is that our fossil fuel emissions are on the rise. In fact, the lead author of this chapter, Karoly, who's the co-chair of the Global Carbon Project, her words at Copenhagen were, "Our carbon emissions are out of control." And this diagram here shows you what she means by that statement. It's billions of tons of carbon dioxide per annum emitted since 1990. And when you think about the fact that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed off in 1992 that agreed that we shouldn't interfere with the planet's climate system at a dangerous level, then since this was ratified by virtually every nation on the planet, including the US and Australia and so on, we've actually done nothing but emitted more and more each year. 41% rise since 1990 is a staggering level to me when you think that there was an international agreement to not interfere with the planet's climate system at dangerous levels. The growth rate in the 1990s was about 1% per year. You can see up to about 2000, and then from 2000 on it shoots up. Now this is partly because of the development of nations like China that were previously low per capita emitters. They've got very low per capita emissions compared to the US and Australia, yet their population is vast. So their emissions are on the rise. This is one of the great political challenges of this issue, is that we've got a lack of equity across the nations of the planet. We've got some low emitters that are on developing trajectories. We've got high emitters that are stagnating with their emissions but not embracing low-emitting technologies. The second major message from the report is that many of the climate indicators that scientists look at are changing at or above the levels that the IPCC projected in 2007. This first diagram is very important to go through. It shows global temperature change since 1980, graphed there in red from year to year. You can see very clearly natural year-to-year variability. This is part of the system. It's exactly what we expect from the climate. When you have an El Nino year, for example, in 1998, there's a very warm year because it's an El Nino year. It would be very foolish to say in the following year that global warming is over because it's just an El Nino kink in the system. It's like saying that summer is over when a cool change comes through in January. It's just not the case. You can see there that blue envelope shows you the natural range of variability, and that linear trend there is exactly what climate scientists would track. We don't track the year-to-year variations. We don't expect the year-to-year variations to match the carbon dioxide levels. We're looking at the decade-by-decade trend, and that is one of warming. I actually ran into Stephen Fielding immediately after our press conference and said to him in a very collegiate manner, "Stephen, this is what we call the Stephen Fielding diagram amongst ourselves." And he took it in good humour, and we had a nice chat. And I showed him this diagram, and I said, "Please go away and look at the text and try to understand what is the difference between interannual variability and long-term change. The planet is warming, and it is warming at the rate the IPCC projected." In contrast, there are other indicators of the climate system that are changing more rapidly than the IPCC projected. So air temperature is on track. It is warming. The last 10 years haven't been one of cooling. They have been warming. But sea ice in the Arctic, for example, this diagram shows you from the year 1900 forward to 2100, the range of IPCC projections for the sea ice coverage over the Arctic Ocean. And you can see the IPCC is projecting a decline in sea ice. Worst case scenarios there is that the Arctic would be ice-free in summer in 2100. The red curve shows the observations, and clearly the observations are tracking below the IPCC projection, so Arctic sea ice is melting way faster than the very worst case of the IPCC models. So that tells us that nonlinear feedbacks there are kicking in faster than we projected several years ago. The system is changing more rapidly than we expected only just 3 years ago from the IPCC reports. Sea level is another indicator. Global sea level is another major indicator of the planet's climate. In glacial times, the glaciers build up, the sea level drops down up to 100 metres. During interglacials, the ice melts over the ice caps and the sea level rises. The IPCC projections of only a few years ago are shown in that grey envelope, and you can see from the satellite observations up to 2009 that we're tracking the very high end of the IPCC projections. So that was the second message. The first message, CO2 emissions are on the rise much more rapidly than they should be if we're concerned about our planet's climate system. The second message is that many indicators are changing more rapidly than we expected they would. So climate is changing more rapidly on the whole. The very last message that I'll spend a couple of minutes on is that our window of opportunity for addressing this problem in a meaningful way is rapidly closing. This diagram shows you in blue the reconstructed temperatures over the last few hundred years back to the year 1600, and then the green, yellow and red curves show scenarios of warming straight from the IPCC fourth assessment reports from 2007. The B1 scenario is a scenario of very rapid emissions reductions, decarbonising at a rate that is not really on the table right now, and the range there, though, indicates the climate sensitivity of the system. We can have carbon feedbacks that are good and kind to us and limit the change to just 2 degrees Celsius. We can have carbon feedbacks in this B1 scenario that push it up over 3 degrees Celsius. The higher range, the A1, F1 range, is the business as usual. A colleague of mine affectionately termed this the George Bush scenario, and the green curve is the European Union scenario. But the George Bush scenario, if I can use that term just to rouse you from your slumber, is one where we have no significant action on reducing our emissions over the next few decades, ongoing population growth, ongoing use of the fossil fuel technologies that we've had operating for several centuries. There's a very different climate in those two curves. The green curve where we attack the emissions and reduce them, and the red curve where we let things go on as business as usual. 7 degrees Celsius global average warming locks in with certainty, for example, the melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. That raises sea level by tens of metres. It takes a long time to melt those glaciers. To melt the West Antarctic ice sheet that will raise sea level by about 3 or 4 metres will take a century or two at least. The glaciologists are concerned that a big slab of that ice sits over the ocean, and nonlinear processes could speed that up. But by and large, we're looking at scenarios at that red end where many of the world's cities that we've established at the coast would need to be relocated, and a scale of adaptation, the cost of which would far outweigh mitigation today. I think this is my last scientific graph, and sorry for so many view graphs in such a short time. I am the last person to have a PowerPoint slide, I believe, bar one. But these red and blue curves here emphasize this point again. The top one is carbon dioxide emissions, the red business as usual, the blue is the kind of trajectory that many nations are advocating to give us some decent chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius global average warming. To achieve that, we need to peak in emissions sooner rather than later. Peaking in emissions, anything after than about 2020, locks in with very high probability exceeding that 2 degree C threshold, which many nations, and in fact in Copenhagen, was adopted as something we should avoid doing. So just to reiterate, my background is a climate scientist. I've shown you a very quick snapshot of the Copenhagen Diagnosis, all in under 10 minutes. If you wish to read further, it is available online, and obviously during the Q&A I'm happy to take questions, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and you covered an enormous amount of science and material in your presentation. We're going to have questions held until the end. We're going to go through all the brief presentations from all the panel members first. And the next panel member is Jenny Goldie, who was in Copenhagen as the National Secretary of Sustainable Population Australia. Jenny's now focusing on setting up an international sort of cooperative activities aimed at developing actions and text for the next Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, trying to address adequately population and environment issues. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you very much, all of you, and to the organisers for inviting me. I am but a mere minnow in the climate change pond, and I'm honoured to be in such company as this. I really am. Not least Ian Frye, who's a very large fish, indeed, in comparison. I attended 2 of the preparatory meetings in Bonn and some of the Bangkok meeting, and then COP15 in Copenhagen. And I often witnessed Ian there in the plenaries representing Tuvalu and putting the case for strong emission reduction targets to save the small island states from inundation. It's also an honour to be with Matt and David, whose papers I often quote. It's wonderful to have a Commissioner for Environment in Maxine who knows what population is. And John Schneider is my next door neighbour, and what more can I say? And don't forget to get the eggs next week, Margot, who's here tonight. My organisation, Sustainable Population Australia, is a national environment organisation with over 1,100 members that seeks ecologically sustainable populations for Australia and for the world. Earlier last year, we applied for observer status to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings and were duly granted that observer status in April. Too late to attend the first of the meetings in Bonn in Germany, but I went on behalf of the organisation to Bonn in June and August. And as I said, in Bangkok, well, my colleague Jane O'Sullivan went to Bangkok and to Barcelona, and another colleague went also to Barcelona. Now, we also wrote a submission which is currently on the UNFCCC website, and the basic thesis of which was that overpopulation, and I define overpopulation as population that is in excess of the resources required to sustain it. Anyway, our thesis was that overpopulation and population growth were both drivers of climate change, and that ending population growth was a tool for both mitigation and adaptation. I set off to Bonn in June, anxious to get this concept of population as a driver of climate change across, though not clear in my head where and how to get actual words inserted into the negotiated text. I wasn't clear whether to link it to gender issues or to RED, RED being reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation of forests. As population is so closely linked to women's issues, I made a point of going to the daily Women's Caucus meetings. And while we got on well, the women, largely from developing countries, were adamant that greenhouse gas emissions were almost wholly a function of overconsumption in the developed world, and thus stabilising population numbers was certainly not a mitigation tool. They were more amenable to the idea that it might be an adaptation tool, as it was self-evident that women with fewer children would have an easier time if displaced by flood, drought, or inundation. And many of them were. Many of them were. The thing that came across so clearly to me in all these preparatory meetings and in Copenhagen was how many women, and men of course, but the women who I was talking to were already affected by drought and by inundation. I mean, the Bangladeshis in particular. Anyway, I reminded the women that a new target under Millennium Development Goal 5, namely universal access to reproductive health, might be a worthwhile objective, but they didn't see the connections with climate change. And later in August, I raised this with Ivo de Boer, the Secretary of UNFCCC, at a civil society meeting, and he too replied that while the issue of population was important, it was not related to climate change and they didn't have to deal with it. And so increasingly I tended to look at the possibilities of connecting population with forestry and agriculture I went to many side events in Bonn in June, as well as attending plenary sessions, and I kept asking questions in question times. Sometimes I'd be misunderstood and get a curt answer such, well, we're not here to blame anyone. Well, I wasn't, at least not those countries that didn't have those health and education services that are necessary for population growth to slow. I was happy enough to blame countries like the US, Canada and Australia that combine both high population growth and very high emissions, and quite unconscionable emissions on the part of Australia. But clearly high population growth in Africa and Southern Asia in particular was not only hurting the people themselves and their ability to produce enough food, but it was also affecting forests, which, as you know, are a major sink. Many speakers at these side events said that to feed the extra 2.5 billion people that we can expect by 2050, that there would need to be an extra 70% food produced by mid-century. One agricultural expert said that 4/5 of this extra food would come from intensification, that is higher yields, and the other 1/5 from extensification, that is cutting down forests. So this land, this 1/5, would essentially mean that the land went from being a sink to a source of emissions. And why? Because of population growth, but also because the poor need to be fed more and with better food. Meanwhile, Professor Ratan Lal from Ohio State University, not the Murari Lal involved in the recent controversy over the Himalayan glacier melt, said that there were some parts of Africa where population growth had already exceeded the potential agricultural productivity of the region, and that is my definition of overpopulation. But to return to the answers to my question in these side events in June, at one of the bigger events, I was treated seriously by one speaker who, while not necessarily agreeing with population growth that it should be included in the text, he did say that it was up to individual countries to include population in their NAPAs, the National Adaptation Plans of Action. And that's indeed what's happening. Of the 41 countries that had submitted their NAPAs before Copenhagen, all but 4 had identified rapid population growth as a problem that exacerbated the effects of climate change and hinders the ability of countries to adapt to it. Nevertheless, there are serious cultural obstacles to achieving population stabilisation in many countries. At the Bangkok preparatory meetings, members of the Nigerian delegation told us cheerfully that Nigerian men still aspired to having 10 children each. In Copenhagen, I attended a side event where the splendidly imposing Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai spoke about her Greenbelt movement. In the same session, a Maasai man spoke about the problems of how each married man was expected to acquire so many cattle, but these same cattle were eating the very trees planted by the women in the Green Belt movement. In question time, I asked whether the Maasai might consider stabilising their numbers through voluntary contraception and in turn the number of their cattle, or stabilising the number of their cattle, in order to reduce the pressure on the trees. He apologetically rejected the notion, explaining large families are part of our culture. In November, my colleague Jane O'Sullivan attended the Barcelona preparatory meeting on SPA's behalf. I didn't go. While I had argued for certain wording in August in Bonn, by this stage we had polished up the proposed wording that we were putting to the various parties, and which Jane in Barcelona put herself to the parties to consider. And this included an addition to the LCA, the Long-Term Commitment to Action, shared vision statement, and our wording was, the parties recognise the fact that all population growth increases the number of both carbon emitters, with bigger impacts in developed than developing countries, and of future climate change victims, thus exacerbating all problems of both mitigation and adaptation, and so on. It was not included. Now, Copenhagen is now generally regarded as a debacle, not because of that. though it's regarded as a debacle because it failed to come up with a FAB agreement, fair, ambitious and binding agreement. On the other, nevertheless, I had a wonderful time in Copenhagen. It was good fun. I shook the hand of Desmond Tutu and I had breakfast with Rajendra Pachauri, Gro Harlem Brundtland, Mary Robinson and Sir David King. So it was good in many ways. Anyway, the fact that a fair, ambitious and binding agreement was not agreed upon, however, gives my organisation and now other like-minded groups from Canada, the UK and the US the opportunity to negotiate better wording for COP16 in Mexico City later this year. Such wording will recognise the view of the UN Population Fund State of the World Population Report 2009, that climate change is more than an issue of energy efficiency and industrial carbon emissions. It is also an issue of population dynamics, poverty and gender equity. The words that we propose will also acknowledge the key recommendation of the Global Humanitarian Forum of 2009, namely that population stabilisation should become a priority for sustainable development, including a strong focus on the empowerment of women and girls. But most importantly, our draft wording will recognise that population growth increases total carbon emissions, especially in developed countries. It increases the number of victims requiring adaptation measures, especially women in developing countries. It inhibits economic development, notably in the least developed countries. But such population growth can be countered by gender equality, human rights, including the right to reproductive health care, and the effective participation of women in action on all aspects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And our next speaker I first saw on television, as many of the people in the audience will have seen. Ian Frye was in Copenhagen as a representative or representing Tuvalu, as a spokesperson for the Alliance of Small Island States, and perhaps as a thorn in the side of a number of bigger countries and other organisations. And Ian, I welcome you to this platform and thank you for joining us on the panel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's certainly a pleasure to see so many people interested in climate change. I was there representing the government of Tuvalu. I've been working for the Tuvalu government for the past 12 years now. What I wanted to discuss here was, I guess seeing this as a good science conference, I thought I would ask the question, did science suffer collateral damage in the political turmoil from Copenhagen, and what does this mean for Tuvalu? So to start off with, to sort of paint you a picture of the meeting, the Copenhagen meeting was actually 6 meetings in one. There were 6 functional elements of the meeting. There was the Conference of Party looking at the convention, there was the meeting of the parties looking at the Kyoto Protocol, and there were 2 working groups, as Jenny had mentioned, one looking at a new agreement on climate change and one review of the Kyoto Protocol, plus 2 other subsidiary bodies. So there were 6 meetings going on at once. So it was a complex meeting to start off with. But the meeting was extraordinary by the fact that the Danish government, the weekend before the start of the meeting, held a meeting of environment ministers, of select number of environment ministers, which is sometimes called the Greenland Dialogue, and the Danish government introduced a draft Copenhagen Accord at that meeting. And that copies of the accord were not allowed to be taken out of the meeting. Nevertheless, copies did make it out of the meeting. And there was, in this document, a draft accord was a reference to 2 degrees Celsius being a sort of ambition, that there would be no real result in Copenhagen, that we would continue negotiations beyond Copenhagen, that we would be looking at an emissions reduction target of 50% by 2050 relative to 1990. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to do. The host country to introduce a conclusion to a meeting before we'd even actually met. And it's extraordinary also by the low level of ambition that they were expecting, that they were suggesting us that we weren't going to have any conclusions. And this is extraordinary considering that over 110 heads of state were going to attend that meeting. So that sort of set the sort of the frame, the thinking of the meeting, you know, which was very disappointing. It led to another group of countries, what are called the basic countries, that's Brazil, South Africa, India, China, presenting their own version of what that accord should look like. A little bit more ambitious, but again, agreeing not to have some legally binding outcome. Then at the start of the meeting, getting back onto the sort of science theme, we had a reference by the Saudi Arabia delegate to what's commonly known as Climategate, which is the leaking of some emails from the Climate Research Centre at the University of East Anglia, where there's a dialogue between IPC scientists and some of their discussions that occurred there. Did that have an effect on the meeting? I mean, there was obviously, the media picked this issue up and, you know, questioned the validity of the IPCC, and that sort of got a bit of a run. But as a person within the meeting itself, I don't think it had a significant impact on our thinking in that regard. We then started off at the beginning of the meeting, and the Alliance of Small Island States, which is 43 small island countries, said we want an outcome that delivers us a temperature limit of below 1.5 degrees Celsius and a stabilisation of 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. The umbrella group, which is a group of industrialised countries, Australia was a spokesperson for that group. It includes Japan, US, Canada, Norway, Iceland and the Russian Federation, said we want a temperature of 2 degrees Celsius and again 50% reductions by 2050. So immediately we had this, you know, conflict. Who was right? What was the science telling us? 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, and what does that really mean? The European Union came in behind the camp of the 2 degrees Celsius. But we have to remember that the EU had agreed on 2 degrees Celsius back in 1996. That was when they came out with that first figure, based on the IPCC's third assessment report. So their conclusions were somewhat dated. Then we progressed into the meeting on the discussions, and we came up against an agenda item where we were to discuss legal texts, which is basically the idea of having some new agreement on climate change. And for a number of countries, 6 countries had actually produced legal texts for consideration in Copenhagen 6 months ago. So in June of 2009, 6 countries had produced a legal text of a conclusion in Copenhagen, and Tuvalu was one of those. And our proposal had, was based on a new agreement on climate change, based on what was called the Bali Action Plan, which we'd agreed 2 years ago. It also had a provision for amendments to the Kyoto Protocol. It had science based on a peaking of global emissions by 2015, and again this 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where we were actually blocked from even considering these legal texts by objections from a number of countries. India, Saudi Arabia were some of those countries. And for us, this was, again, quite disturbing. We wanted conclusions at this meeting. We knew that there were over 110 heads of state, and we thought with the appropriate level of ambition and political will, we could have reached an agreement of a legal agreement in Copenhagen. And for Tuvalu, that was a crucial issue. If we look at the predictions of sea level rise, based on the most recent science, Tuvalu is likely to be one of the first countries to disappear. Obviously, we don't want to face that inevitability, but clearly that's one of the serious problems. The highest point in the whole of Tuvalu is 4 metres above sea level. On average, most of the population live below 2 metres. And the widest point of the capital of Tuvalu is 600 metres. So you've got sea on either side and at its highest, with 600 metres of sea of land with sea on either side. But that's not the only issue. There are all sorts of problems with warming of the global oceans causing coral bleaching. There are estimates that we've already lost 16% of the globe's coral reefs. There are also problems with ocean acidification, where the carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean is weakening coral and other calcite material. And in fact, there are predictions which suggest that if global atmospheric concentrations reach 450 parts per million, all coral will die as a result of ocean acidification. So there are obviously serious concerns for a country like Tuvalu. So we progressed into the negotiations. We continued in these 6 meetings, and by the second last night, it was becoming clear that we weren't going to reach a conclusion on any substantive outcome. So there was feverish activity led by the Danish government to have reintroduced this Copenhagen Accord and to have this being the major outcome of the meeting. And so the ministers, again, a select number of ministers met overnight on the Friday night of the last night of Copenhagen. Tuvalu was not invited to that meeting. And they produced what was called the Copenhagen Accord. And in fact, President Obama announced to the media before the Copenhagen Accord had even been brought to the main plenary of the meeting that we had a deal. We'd agreed on this, which was, again, extraordinary. And I made comment about this in the plenary, saying, are we having negotiations by the media or within a UN process? And I consider that to be disrespectful of a UN process, that here we have the President of the United States announcing that we'd concluded the meeting when we hadn't even brought it back to the meeting as a whole. In the final wash-up, we rejected this Copenhagen Accord. Again, it refers to 2 degrees Celsius, which we think would be spell a demise at Tuvalu if we agreed on that. There was no mention of a peaking year. There was looking about a peaking year, but no year to set a time frame for peaking of emissions. It linked adaptation to the impacts of climate change, building resilience to the impact of climate change, to compensation to oil-producing countries. So the funding you see linked to that, and if you get a copy of the Copenhagen Accord, you'll see the words response measures in it. And that's code for compensation to oil-producing countries. So the funding that was offered in the Copenhagen Accord was not only helping the vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, it was helping the vulnerable countries to the compensation for loss of oil revenue. And those words were clearly linked. And we'd fought very hard in Bali to de-link those issues. And yet they came back again. So obviously this was a serious concern for us. There were another group of countries, mainly Latin American countries, Cuba, Venezuela, who were concerned about the process and so objected to the Copenhagen Accord primarily on process, that they hadn't been involved in negotiations, and here we were being given this outcome as a fait accompli. And finally, Sudan spoke up against it because of the concerns that, as the ambassador for Sudan said, it would make Africa a furnace if we had those outcomes. So what can we conclude from this? The Copenhagen Accord has no legal basis, but there's a lot of political pressure to get countries to sign on now. I'm aware in the Pacific that the European Union and Japanese government have been making diplomatic overtures to Pacific Island countries to sign on to this agreement. I think in conclusion we can say that science and Tuvalu fared very poorly in Copenhagen, but I think it could have been worse if we had the Copenhagen Accord. So there is a sort of glimmer of light in that we are continuing negotiations. But in essence, it rests on the United States. The United States having the highest per capita emissions and the highest historical emissions globally weren't able to bring anything to the table in Copenhagen. Because of their circumstances, their domestic legislation. Their domestic legislation is being held up in the Senate, and the passage of that legislation is going to be difficult, and particularly after the recent by-election in Massachusetts, where the Republicans won a stronghold Democratic seat. So, we will continue the negotiations and hopefully we'll have a better outcome in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And now we go from the global scale to a rather more local and regional scale. And our next speaker is Maxine Cooper, who is the Commissioner for Sustainability and Environment for the Australian Capital Territory. And Maxine will give, if you like, this perspective of a regional scale and what is needed at the local and regional scale. And then our final speaker will be John Schneider. Both Maxine and John were not in Copenhagen.
Thank you very much for listening to me tonight. First thing I'm going to say is, how do you feel? Right at this moment, I feel pretty devastated. You know, I hear the scientist, Matt comes up, and every time I hear a scientist like Matt, my heart skips a beat and my head whizzes around. Not for the way it would have when I was 16, but certainly at my age now. Matt, the impact you scientists have is enormous, and it really is. And if I, as a professional who are committed in terms of trying to make change to do things, still feel that way, either we've missed it completely as a society, or else we're all out there partying like there's no tomorrow and we really don't care. So for me, when I hear the scientists, one of the things I have to do in my role is to say, how do we communicate that with Mary and Joe public out there so that we actually get buy-in, commitment for action? One of the things I do in my role as Commissioner, and there are 5 commissioners like me in the world, we're generally charged with some things like listening to complaints against government. We're charged with doing investigations into some specific issues. We report on significant issues, and for my role in the region, I report on what the ACT's environment's like and what needs to be done and what the ACT government's doing. And regionally, I write the Regional State of the Environment report. And then I also am charged with the role of raising awareness and being an advocate for doing things in a more sustainable manner than we currently do. So given that context, one of the things I do an enormous amount is listen. I listen, I collect data, and then what I try and do is bridge the community and the scientists together to try and forge a way ahead on some of these issues. And being out there and around, when I didn't go to Copenhagen, I was out and around in the region, and I guess there are 3 C's that come to mind for me. There's enormous concern out there, and so the head spins and your heart skips a beat, but then you jump into some confusion. If you talk to people, they don't even understand what the national politics are. They know that Copenhagen was going on. They're really not sure what was going on there. And then also in terms of the confusion, at a local level, if I want to go and do something, where do I go and do it? And I haven't got the time to stick photovoltaics on my house and do a whole lot of that. But here in the ACT, we're pretty cashed up. Is there somewhere I can go and pay 15K to somebody who'll tell me how to do something and I'll do it? No, we don't have those systems in place. But then I find also out there, which I think is really fantastic here in the ACT and the Australian Capital Region, there's an enormous amount of commitment. Well, damn it all, I'm actually going to do something personal in my own backyard or in my work or wherever I can to make a difference. And so going through all of that, when I write the State of the Environment report, one of the things that I'm very pleased about is here in the ACT, it has to be tabled in the Assembly. The government then has to respond to those recommendations, and then every year I have to report on how they're implementing those. In the region, I don't have legislative power, but I have the support of the 17 abutting councils, and what they're doing now is they're putting in place the findings from their State of the Environment report in their strategic plans and their annual reports. But it does mean talking and going out and working with the communities. So I think that's sort of another way, apart from the big picture level that we're seeing at Copenhagen, we can make a difference. But in terms of that commitment, the other thing, thinking about, well, how does the community respond? Do they get dizzy heads and their heart skips a beat? I think some people simply tune off. So how do you actually get people to tune in, stay on the journey that we need to be on if we're actually going to survive into the future, and when future generations come and think about what we've handed to their generation, it's not one of disgust, but it's one of, well, you did try and make a difference given where you're all at. One of the things I just do on a local level is, with this technical State of the Environment report, we also do snapshots. These snapshots are written in lay language, and they essentially say, this is what's happening out there by everyday people, making a difference in every way. So we did 60 snapshots, and they range from giving examples of the retrofitting of buildings to make them more energy efficient, right through to talking about things like in Bega, there's a community group called Clean Energy for Eternity. That group started off quite small, it's now grown. Their vision is 50-50 by 2020, which means 50% renewable energy by 2020 and a 50% reduction in the energy levels that currently exist. And they actually are now forming partnerships across the region, and they've even involved the Mosman City Council. Again, looking at the demographics there, quite a wealthy council, partner that in to try and get some real changes out there in the community. So we did a whole lot of these snapshots about all these fascinating things that were going on in the community. We then gave it back to the local governments to then promote in the newspaper, get articles. Because the one thing people do want to know is, can we make a difference and who's making a difference? And I would argue very much at the local level, you hear things like, there's a whole sea change, tree change, all of those changes going on. Yes, people are. And then we actually have to deal with the complex issues, as I was talking to John before about. John's a tree changer, I would argue. He's gone out and he's, doing the rural thing out there. And then even that's not simple, because you look at the changing landscape. And yes, we're creating more biodiversity and adaptation thing out there in terms of corridors and linkage. We're replacing the monoculture with a whole lot of things. You get up in the helicopter, we're building more dams out there. Oh, hang on, what does that do to the water? People are commuting more. So there's a whole mixed lot of things going on that we don't understand the real impacts of, yet people are trying to do the right thing. So are we monitoring those at the state level? I think not, the total cumulative impact. I do think we're in the middle of a revolution, and one of my heroes in terms of looking for the big picture stuff is a Professor Ian Lowe. And Ian argues that there are 4 things we need for change to occur. And I would argue that of his 4 things, we've got 3 of them. First of all, discontent. Well, we're mostly unhappy. We're, the spinning head and beating hearts. We need a vision for a better future. Well, I think we've actually got a lot of that. There's a lot of things happening out there, and there are a lot of people saying, well, we've got to shift, We've got to shift from the way we do things, and people are arguing what the new shifts can be. People are starting to put pathways in place, be it technology, be it in behaviour change. And now the next one I think is our biggest one, a commitment. And Ian Lowe argues the politics of sustainability to address things like climate changes hinges on developing the public's commitment to a sustainable future to a level that will make it politically irresistible. And I think that's what we're hearing from Copenhagen. How do we make it that politically irresistible that we all do it? And we need to do it not only at the Copenhagen level, we need to do it at the state level, the Commonwealth level, and the local government level. And I do think it's through the power of some of the community moving well ahead of where some of the government policies are at to actually take it into their own hands. And I also think it's up to you and I, and every time I meet with a group like this, I actually ask people to reflect on what you're going to do in the next 6 months that would make a difference. Because you've got to make it personal if we're actually going to get these changes. And may I also say, one of the other interesting things my office has been involved in, looking at how do you get those changes. We're a really, really small office, but what we've also done is we've engaged with the young people. The people from about 18 to 35 generally are pretty busy, not as engaged on these issues maybe as other sectors of the community. The older sector and the younger sector, through things like the Australian Aussie school programs, are certainly connected, and then older people in terms of having more time at the end of their career to invest in society get involved. So we actually have what's called young people's ambassadors. And in doing that, some of the lessons we're learning is the different ways that people communicate in that age group. We're also learning that the most powerful thing you can do in terms of change is your peer group. You can do all the campaigns you like with ads, you can do a whole suite of things, but the research is showing up that it's the peer group discussions at the dinner table, around the coffee bars that will make a difference. And let me just share with you, 1 minute, some words. The first conference on psychology of climate change was held in Bristol in March last year. And it was argued that the greatest obstacle to action are not technical, economic or political. They are the denial strategies that we all adopt. And they offered two things. They said, reframe climate change in a way that rejects the green cliches and creates new metaphors with a wider resonance. For example, don't talk about saving the polar bears, but talk about energy independence and the potential for new enterprises. And they also said, rely on peer pressure, as it's probably the most important influence of all. And I'll conclude with the words that we use a fair amount in terms of talking with people, giving them examples, trying to sort of show them what can be done and what they can do. And that is, Ian Lowe's other words, which we use a lot, is the future's not somewhere we're going. It's actually something we're creating, whether it be through turning off the light switch as something as simple as that to save energy, through to going to Copenhagen and trying to make the big policy decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Our last speaker is John Schneider, and he's head of Risk and Impact Analysis Group in Geoscience Australia. And you might ask, what's a geoscientist going to talk about? His role is to talk about natural disasters, and his research and Geoscience Australia is addressing the issues of natural disasters and their impacts on Australia.
Great, thank you, David, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. As David said, I'm not a climate scientist. I am a scientist, but my role in this space is really, I think, and the role of the group that I represent at Geoscience Australia, is really in the space between the climate science and the application or the adaptation or risk management of that. What we're trying to do is develop information, models, tools, databases, what have you, that take the best of climate science information and try to translate that into what the impacts might be in terms of what society actually feels. That is, the natural hazards, the disasters, the things that we as society will need to adapt to as time moves on. And one of the biggest questions is around, I think there's still a lot of controversy and a lot of work to be done around that issue of, we understand, for instance, that temperature is rising. We understand that we can measure that, and we know that it is a real effect. But the issue around whether this temperature rise and other factors are actually contributing to changes in natural hazards and potential disasters is an area that is still quite uncertain, and there's still quite a bit of work to be done. So in the rush to try to adapt to climate change, I would argue there's still quite a bit of work to be done to try to really understand how climate change will affect us as people. So what we do is we work to develop computer simulation tools and so forth that look at different types of hazards, not just climate-related hazards, but also earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, but also severe storms, including storm surge, severe wind, and so forth. All of these contribute to the mix of hazards and potential disasters that impact our society. And the information that we provide then to government, to industry, to the public is all about trying to cast that into information that can be used to try to mitigate or adjust to those issues. So we talk about disasters in terms of economic cost, in terms of impact to buildings, to potential mortality. We try to use that information to inform building codes, to inform insurance policy, to inform education policy, et cetera. Now, the climate work we have been involved with is most recently we have contributed to the National Coastal Vulnerability Assessment that was put together by the Department of Climate Change, and a recent report called Climate Change Risk to Australia's Coast has just been published. That work, the contribution that Geoscience Australia made to that was largely around the potential impact of sea level rise and associated storm surge to coastal communities. And the end result of that was an estimate of about 270,000 residential homes that could potentially be affected by sea level rise by the year 2100. And while that is a best estimate at this point, it is a reasonable, we think a reasonable estimate, and something that is significant, that not only deserves attention from the point of view of how we might mitigate that risk, but there's also underlying that a lot of uncertainty about exactly where those effects might be the greatest. So there is yet another significant body of work that needs to be done to try to better understand what those sort of impacts might be, and how at the local level we can actually help local government and others to actually address the risk. Now a slide here. This slide, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and impact. This is basically how we can simply divide up the risk picture. And this slide basically says that the impact of a natural disaster is a combination of those three factors. The hazard is the natural phenomenon. The exposure is basically the people, the assets, and whatever we feel is at risk. The vulnerability is essentially the relationship between those two. That is how we might be affected by, or how our homes, our assets might be affected by a hazard. So in understanding, for instance, what the climate signature is to natural disasters, that is, there is a lot of suggestion that climate change is contributing to an increase in natural disasters. It's important in order to unravel that to understand the difference between these three factors. Let's see, wait, wrong, how do I move? Yeah, there we go. So what we do is essentially try to pick this apart, and one of the ways of doing that is to use historical events as well as computer models to try to separate those things that we view as, say, occurring day to day versus annually, on a decadal basis, on a 1 in 100-year basis, versus those things that we might call extreme events or extreme impact. So we have probability on one side versus impact, and that impact can be dollars, it can be deaths, it can be loss of land value, it can be any number of measures. But the idea is that we can try to understand the relationship between these factors. Now, if you increase climate change, if you increase, by increasing the effect of climate change, you're in effect, you're causing the probability of bad things to go up. Whereas if you're increasing the exposure or the value of the things that are impacted, you're basically making the curve move to the right. But either way, the net effect is more risk or more impact. So typically, historical events are those that occupy the left side of this curve, and the catastrophic or things that may be out in the future tend to occupy the right side of the curve. Now, an interesting thing has come up, just published in the news early this week, in fact, page 1 of the Australian on Monday, had a report saying that the IPCC had been, not sure what word to use, had perhaps been ill-advised in putting out information on the relationship between climate change and potential disasters. And I won't elaborate on the issue. David may want to say a few words, but the issue basically boils down to this. We know that over time, and this is a plot from Munich Re, and I thank Sandra Schuster of Munich Re for providing this. Munich Re collects information on natural disasters worldwide, and this plot then shows over the last 30 years the trend in what have been classified as natural disasters, and there are thresholds for mortality, there are thresholds for dollars. But the net effect is that whether you look at earthquakes or, say, geophysical events in red, meteorological events or hydrological events, the trend is increasing. And the most logical way to explain the fact that it's increasing, or one of them, would be that we are seeing an increase in population, we're seeing an increase in people living in more vulnerable areas, we're seeing more assets, we're seeing more capital investment. And so one of the ways to potentially separate the effect of exposure or vulnerability versus climate change influence is to split this into the geophysical ones, earthquakes and tsunamis, which most would argue don't have a climate, are not related to climate change, versus those, the meteorological and hydrological, that do. And you can see in both cases there's a trend upward, but the trend upward in the percentage change on the hydrological or meteorological side is somewhat greater, about double the effect, or somewhere between a third and somewhere between, say, 50% and double the effect. So the argument really revolves around how significant that additional effect is, and if we can attribute that to climate change. Now, because there's a lot of variability in that curve, or those curves, it's very difficult to say unequivocally that climate change is actually observed in these data, and that's really what the argument revolves around. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be complacent about the issue. In fact, I would argue that climate, the fact that there are valid reasons to think that climate change is affecting natural disaster impacts and potentially increasing those impacts. From a risk management point of view, there is every reason to say that we should actually be capturing that potential within our models, within our tools, whether it be improving building codes, applying insurance mechanisms, changing land use policy. We basically have an argument for improving our contingencies against those possible impacts. And so from a good risk management point of view, whether the evidence is strong or weak to date, there's still plenty of reason to think that we should be addressing it. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, John. And now we move to the next phase of this panel discussion. And so please take it away.
Very in line, for example, with the Nature paper, which showed that holistic medicine. But when I saw the hockey stick was back, I thought I'd ask a couple of questions about that. The first one is, I'd like to know where you got the data from tide gauges, which showed just small changes in water level, because I used to work with the RA hydrographer. It's like measuring the things of the human hair that's the water can't do that. The other thing is, in the 1990 IPCC paper, we had a mini warm period and we had a mini ice age that seemed to disappear. Can someone explain what it meant to?
Can you just ask one question?
Well, I think that's two. Because it's all on the same graph. And the other one is, when would anyone like to comment on the criticism made by Catherine about the use by the CIU of a model which would give you a hockey stick increase in global temperatures no matter what day you put in?
So I presume that question's addressed to Matt England, although if Matt doesn't want to answer it, then I can pick up the pieces.
Yeah, I'll kick in. Actually, David was a co-author of the Copenhagen Diagnosis, so we'll probably tag team on these science questions. Tide gauge data, there's global distributions of tide gauges. The first one, I think, was put in Brittany in the early 19th century. Those global average numbers are detecting that smaller rise that you saw earlier in the record. The satellite data is add to that, but tide gauge data today is absolutely reliable. You take a global average of all the data points you have. You can use models to interpolate between the existing observations, but they're reliable data. I don't see what the question is about those. But the second question on the medieval warm period, it's absolutely visible in Mike Mann's Nature paper, the Arctic reconstruction that came out of Nature recently. You can see it gets warmer during the medieval period, but it's nothing like the warming that we've seen over the 20th century. It's about a third of the scale. It's also very much limited to the Northern Hemisphere. It's one of the features of that period. It wasn't a global scale warming period. It was very much North Atlantic centred, and it's thought to be related to regional climate oscillations like the North Atlantic Oscillation in the Atlantic region.
And there was the last part about the statistical technique.
You want to answer that one?
Sure. So there was concern raised. I think the two gentlemen you were talking about were McIntyre and McKittrick. They raised a concern about a specific scientific analysis technique that was used by Mike Mann in his paper that produced the hockey stick. There was a problem with that analysis technique that was analysed, but several different independent analysis techniques produce exactly the same results that show that the warmth of the last 3 decades for hemispheric average temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere or for global average temperatures is warmer than any time in at least the last 1,000 years, probably even longer. So there is no doubt that the recent temperatures for global average temperatures are warmer than the medieval warm period. We have another question. Yes? Yep.
I'm not a climatologist at all, but I have a question for Jenny. I'm just about to move back into the ACT after an absence of about 10 years. I've just had a house built. 2 things occur to me. One is related to the house. Is the ACT government taking steps to encourage people to move to evaporative cooling rather than using refrigerated air conditioning? And the second barrel of the question is the ACT government planning to encourage some entrepreneur to set up a biochar plant in the ACT, and if not, why not?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Turn it off. But I'm going to assume your question's for Maxine rather than for Jenny, because Maxine's the commissioner.
I beg your pardon, Maxine.
That's okay.
That's okay. I can't speak on behalf of the ACT government because I don't actually work for the government. Although I am funded, I'm like the Ombudsman and many other entities that's independent. And I would have to get back to you. If you give me details later, I can get back to you on the second one and ask somebody in government to get back to you. And on the first, to my knowledge, the answer on the second one is no, but I could be incorrect. And on the first one, there are standards around new homes. They are trying to force through higher energy efficiency ratings. So definitely on that. The big challenge for us in every city is the retrofitting. What do you do with some of the older buildings and how do you encourage that? And they do have a program called the Home Energy Advisory Team, whereby for $30, somebody will come out to your home and look at it and tell you what energy efficiency measures you need to put in place. And then, again, I'll have to check on the details. And if you put those in place, you get a certain rebate. Unfortunately for that program, as I report in my annual report, that program has a very small uptake in terms of the overall impact. All those kind of incentive programs generally are limited in terms of their impact. They're also programs that are generally taken up by people, pardon me, already doing it. So people are already committed in that direction. So happy later if you give me your card or something, I'll try and get an answer for the second one.
The next question from down here.
Jackie Giselle from the AMU. I was also going to ask about the hockey stick stuff, but I'll skip to another question, which is directed at Maxine. But I was interested in how you suggested that peer pressure might be the best way to go, or the appropriate way to go in terms of engaging people about climate change. But to me, that sort of smacks, so it's a bit of a coercion model. I'm just wondering if that's a sort of that's a useful model in terms of trying to encourage people to engage in surely it's better to get people to try and think through themselves.
We try and get people to think things through themselves, but in terms of the psychology that I understand, again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a scientist, I just try and synthesise the information, but there's psychology research coming out clearly says peer pressure works better than sitting down intellectually. And I guess being a parent right at this moment dealing with some teenage children, I'd have to say peer pressure, just by sheer example, in that category, seems to work better than intellect.
It might work better as the
Well, I think we do it in every generation, and I think they debate it through. I mean, I'm not assuming this is sort of a toothpaste tube where you sort of cut it off and then you sort of put it in your mouth and that's it. I believe every human's highly intelligent at each level that we go through in our ageing process, and I just observe in that particular youth category, they're highly intelligent. They're also, if you like, the potential people in very important positions looking after us in our old age. And so they're to me, a very powerful group, and I don't think there's anything wrong with peer pressure. There's a lot of peer pressure in some very antisocial behaviours. I can't see why you'd want some positive behaviour through that process anyway. I'd be open to any other member of the panel views on that.
Jeff Evans.
I think it's on.
No affiliation. Why is it, I'd like the panel, anyone on the panel to answer this question, that the science of climate change itself, as distinct from what should be done about it or who pays, tends to be seen as a left-right political issue, an ideological issue. Senator Minchin, for instance, even said recently on an ABC program that climate change, he thought, was a left-wing conspiracy. Very important matter, because if this is the case, it means that the community is automatically split roughly 50-50 one way or the other. And the chances of getting a political consensus are so much the greater because people affiliate with one side or the other. Could I have comments, please?
I've started this, and I think maybe other panel members have opinions, but I can't stand the fact that it's got an ideological tweak to it. I was once introduced as a climate change believer, and this term really annoyed me because it's basically it's a physics question. We're increasing greenhouse gases. We know for over 150 years the radiative properties of greenhouse gases very well, and blanketing the Earth's atmosphere with higher concentrations of these gases will simply warm the planet. Exactly how this manifests regionally and at what scale and how much the ice melts at what scale and so on is all a complex scientific question, but the actual basic premise of greenhouse gas warming the planet is so simple that it shouldn't be pitched as an ideology. And I think that it's really the denialists on this side, or the people who want to derail the science, who'd like to pitch it as an ideology, because then it becomes something that is polarising. And I think this really very much plays into the hands of making the science seem like it's on an agenda. And I should point out that, and David was fantastic on the ABC after the great climate change swindle to say that he was a sceptic, and Tony Jones paused and thought, what the hell's going on? I thought he was my scientist. But what David meant by that was that he was, as a scientist, incredibly sceptical of everything that comes across his table, and that's what science is about. It's about questioning the established wisdom, and all of my best PhDs and postdocs do not accept what I advise them is the reality. They go and work it out for themselves. So to pitch climate change science as an ideology is completely the opposite of what it is, because it's like any good field of science, it's scrutinised highly, full of scepticism, full of debate, and that's how the knowledge is progressed.
John wanted to add something. While John's doing that, I'd just like to add that Margaret Thatcher, who wasn't considered to be particularly on the left wing of politics, was one of the strongest supporter of the improvement in understanding of climate change science. So it is not a left-right divide in the political issues.
I just wanted to add that I think from a risk scientist perspective and from a perspective that, in a sense, I don't have an axe to grind about whether climate is changing or not, but by looking at the issues from different sides, I think most people would argue, whether they're skeptics or not, that there is still a chance that climate is changing and that humans are contributing to it. So there is really a whole spectrum of views. There are people who are well and truly polarized and would say, no, not going to happen. There are others who are 100% convinced, but there's a whole lot of people in between who have varying views on what climate change may mean for them or for society. If one looks at it that way, from an analytical point of view, one can handle uncertainty or that gray area in between in very objective ways and still make sound decisions that accommodate that uncertainty. And I think that's one of the ways that, one thing that we can do better from a government point of view, from a science point of view, to help people interpret what climate change means to them and how we might better deal with it.
Okay, question in the back.
Sorry.
Yep. One of those two.
John McCarthy from the AMU. It's a question for Ian Frye. A lot of the commentary around the time of Copenhagen blamed the Chinese for the collapse of the talks, and you never mentioned the Chinese. I'm just wondering what your perspective is on the role of the Chinese in the collapse of the talks. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It is an interesting one, and I have a feeling there was a bit of a media beat-up about the role of China in the negotiations. Clearly, you know, it's a sort of domino effect, or a standoff. We have the United States not willing to do anything, and then if we look from a purely scientific basis, you know, the US has produced the most amount of greenhouse gases in the world. So why would China do something if the United States was not going to do something? And there was clearly an approach in Copenhagen to paint China as the villain in the process. And I think that's a false impression. Obviously, they have to do something, and we don't deny that. But clearly, there has to be, you know, a staging process to allow China to fulfill some of its development needs, as well as reducing its emissions. But clearly, the United States must take the lead.
My name's Maria Francis from a local community website called Climate Exchange. My concern is about the urban forest, and I think you would have all seen trees that are dying around us, and I'm not only alert but also becoming very alarmed. And I know there's an inquiry where there are going to be consultations, and our submissions have to be due by the end of February, but I haven't seen a discussion paper on the website. I don't know when the consultations are going to be. So my question to Maxine is, how do we handle the emergency? Is there any way that we can save the trees that are currently so stressed? And how does that help us buy time to do the planning for the long term for the urban forest? Because I don't know what the latest projections are for climate change here in Canberra, but are we looking really in the long term at trees not being able to survive in this landscape? And are we looking at a dust bowl?
Right, big questions. May I just say again, I'm not within the ACT government, but I am doing an investigation into the urban forest, as well as how to manage trees. And we have asked for submissions to be in. If your group needs more time, can we talk later? And I'm open to giving you more time. The process that I go into in the investigations is we call for public submissions so that the community has a chance to put their issues forward before we actually then go into analysing some of the information we have. We are charged with, and this is a pretty major investigation, with bringing the investigation to a closure by June. So we're anticipating we will achieve that deadline, and all the questions you asked are certainly ones we're asking as we're going through that investigation. So I don't have the answers now for you, but we're certainly committed to producing, if you like, reports and all of that, and engaging with the community, and we are even looking in the next couple of months of having some community forums north and south.
Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Kevin White, no affiliation. Does anyone on the panel believe that the best way to arrest climate change or global warming is adopting nuclear power as opposed to coal power? And secondly, just for non-specialists, non-scientists such as myself, is it reasonable to just accept the scientific consensus on an issue? After all, we accept consensus on a whole range of things we don't understand, like vaccination. Is it fair, as long as there's open debate and no suppression of evidence, to just accept the scientific consensus? Thank you.
Who would like to take that on the panel? So,
nuclear, well, I'd like to say something about nuclear. I spent the 1980s marching the streets against nuclear. So I had a very strong position in those days. I'm sort of more open to argument now that it may be necessary to stave off. It could be a possible way of staving off disaster, just buying us time. But, however, there are major problems still with nuclear. There are new generations of nuclear reactors which are better than the ones in the 1980s that we were campaigning against. But nevertheless, there's a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted just in the mining and the milling and the building of the mining and milling of uranium, and the building of and then decommissioning of reactors. And those greenhouse gas emissions, the fossil fuels use and the greenhouse gas emissions have to be part of the equation. I mean, once the reactors are built, the emissions may be low, but it is not. It is certainly not part of the whole picture, and we have to take into account those other aspects. And another issue, which I'm not sure that the answer is that often people say it takes too long to bring these things online, and we don't have that time. We have to turn the situation around in 6 years. Other people say you can bring them online in 3 years. I think probably the reality is more like 10 if you try very hard, but it's not. It's probably on balance, and my position is that it's not going to be the saviour that some people say it will be.
I was going to speak about this now. Just one quick thing about nuclear. I've heard in Germany, I know of experts who say nuclear needs to be in the mix. I know of experts who say it doesn't need to be there at all. I have no expertise in this area, but I do know that in Germany one of the problems with nuclear being there is that they've got tremendous wind energy resources there, and wind and nuclear do not go together very well. When you have a windy day, you need to basically power down a nuclear reactor. This is not something you can do on the scales of wind changes. You need weeks to do this. So apparently it's highly incompatible with some of the renewable sector energies, and that's certainly one of the concerns I have about that technology.
Just quickly on nuclear power, from a Pacific Island perspective, the Pacific witnesses a number of shipments of highly radioactive material travelling between Japan and Europe on a regular basis, with spent fuel rods going from Japan for reprocessing, and then the return of that material back to Japan for storage. And there is no liability regime, there is no compensation regime to protect Pacific Island countries if one of those ships ran aground and spilt their waste. So there are still serious problems associated with nuclear power as far as guaranteeing environmental protection. So there is a problem of being able to resolve one issue and creating another environmental problem.
Sorry to grab the microphone again, but there was this question of scientific consensus and how do you trust the scientific consensus. If you go to the doctors with an awful cough and she asks you, gee, do you smoke cigarettes, and you confess you smoke a packet a day, and she tells you this is great scientific consensus that smoking cigarettes is bad for your health. You could choose to ignore that consensus, or you could choose to follow up the decades-long research. And I think there is a very clear analogy with climate research. This climate research Al Gore, Neville Nichols famously once said in a talk I saw him give, Al Gore did not invent climate change. The science behind climate change is decades old. It's actually over a century old. And this is not something that's been made up in the last few years just because we had nothing better to do at that time. It's a genuine consensus across all the credible scientific organisations on the planet that greenhouse gases are changing our climate system. On the other hand, you could go and choose to trust some of the skeptics and the things they're saying, but I really would advise folks to go and drill down through their CVs, and generally you'll come across track records in fossil fuel emitting industries or with directorships of mining companies, and I think it's easy to see conflict of interest in some of those skeptics' CVs. There's nothing to be gained from a climate scientist in the world reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's nothing to be gained as a scientist to say we have certainty around this issue. The best thing that we could do to talk up our funding would be to say, Ian Plummer could be right. We need to do more. We need more funding and more research. In Europe, there's a real push away from funding the climate science toward funding the solution, because the European governments and the leaders of the research agencies there see so clearly the scientific problem is in finding the solution. It's not doing further study of that problem.
Locally, in terms of the debate around nuclear or renewable, can I just remind us here locally that we only have 8% of our energy renewable energy at the moment. To me, in a region like this where we've got solar access so good, where we've got wind, where we've even got the ocean sitting on the coast there to use some of the energy from that, we have to ask ourselves, are we crazy in not actually jumping to the future as a region and becoming a renewable energy region and shifting that 8% renewable energy much higher? So I know we've got debates around, the bigger policy questions, but at the local level, I think there's some major gains through actually saying, yes, let's go renewable. The amount of industry that it would generate would be quite significant.
I know we've got a question back here, someone's got the microphone. There's also some people who've been very patient, a man down here, next after that, and then a gentleman here, and a gentleman there, and if there were any more ladies or gentlemen who were less than 50, or even less than 30 who had questions, that would be fantastic. So, a lady here and a gentleman here.
My question's for, sorry, my name is Louisa Sheeholt. My question's for Ian Frye. I'm just wondering, because of the clear difficulties of gaining global consensus in relation to emissions, just wondering whether there was any talk by your alliance of pushing for global consensus for displaced persons, i.e. the insertion of a clause relating to environmental refugees into, say, the Copenhagen Accord, or, sorry, is that too convoluted? Yeah, so I was thinking that could be a possible solution, underlining that, many Pacific Island nations will be underwater, may actually provoke countries into action if they then have to accommodate displaced persons. So that, yeah, was there any talk of...
Not specifically in the Accord, but in the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action, which is coming forward with a new agreement on climate change, the discussion around one element called the shared vision had a discussion about migration and displaced people. It's a very sensitive issue for Pacific Island countries and for other countries. In Tuvalu's situation, their view is quite different to Kiribati. Tuvalu does not want to see language about forced migration or migration, whatever, because people believe that they want to have a future there. Whereas Kiribati is more nuanced, saying we're looking at migration programs. And it's a sensitive cultural issue, so finding the right language to deal with those sensitivities is quite difficult.
Could I just say something on that?
Ross Garner, I think, recently said that Australia has an obligation to accept environmental refugees from the Pacific, and I think that's quite reasonable. But in a conversation I had now 30 years ago with Paul Cullen, who was then head of the Refugee Council, he said, do we take the first 50 million Bangladeshis or the second 50 million? And that is stuck in my mind. And when you look at possible sea level rise and understand that how much of Bangladesh will be lost with just a 1 metre sea level rise, which we can probably expect by the end of the century, we're not just talking about a few thousand refugees from the Pacific, we're talking about literally millions of people.
In recent times, Kevin Rudd and Steve Brax and Bob Carr and the like have suggested that Australia can increase its population. I just wonder what the views of the panel are on what the sustainable population of Canberra might be able to be by 2050 and Australia.
Could I say that Bob Carr doesn't advocate population growth, he's advocating stabilisation, as you'll see on the 7:30 report this week.
A series on population. Prime Minister, however, does endorse the concept of a big Australia, as he calls it, or 35 million for Australia, although I have to say that with current growth rate in Australia that we're heading for a doubling of population by 2045 on current trends. Not 35 million, but more like 44 million. Anyway, in terms of Canberra, Maxine and I were having a conversation about this before we went in. There is such a thing as Liebig's law, which says that carrying capacity depends on the resource and less supply. And I would argue that water is the resource in least supply in the Canberra region, and that our dams have been sitting at around 50% full for the last several years, or at least since they've had the signs up on the road that I read when I go past. I mean, the dams aren't filling, and meanwhile Canberra's population is growing by several thousand every year, and clearly this can't continue. So we would argue that we should be working for the region, not just Canberra, but for stabilisation as soon as possible.
The ACT has an ecological footprint of 8.5 global hectares per person, and that's about 15 to 17% above the national average. At a globe, we've got around about allocated 2.2 global hectares in terms of what's average. And what we really need to be at is around about 1.8 global hectares per person. The ACT generally therefore uses the resources of a place 11 times larger than what we are. So when we actually talk about what our population should be, I think we've also got to turn that on its head a bit and say, well, what's our impact on other populations by the lifestyles that we're going about? And if you look at Canberra, our design around the car, high transport use, a whole lot of things, I think we're a city that if you were able to come back, and I won't, I'll be gone, in 50 years' time and look back, 50 years' time we'll be much more consolidated. Some of the issues that we're arguing in terms of our spatial qualities and all the rest will be a very different city. I can't see that our population won't increase. I think we've got to look at transport in the region and planning in the region, and I would hope to guide us, instead of actually having the boundary as an issue between sort of the ACT and New South Wales, we actually in the not too distant future sit around the table and say, let's have a regional plan for development, let's have a regional plan for transport, and let's have a regional plan in terms of the capacity of this region to support that population, and really look at what we have to do. And in terms of water, we're certainly progressing at a national level on some of those issues. But maybe it'd pay for the ACT people to take more out of the system for the population we need and actually subsidise South Australia or cities downstream in terms of how they get their water. I think we've really got to look at things in a very different way. And to use my language, we need some major transformational changes in the way we go about this rather than incremental changes, because the incremental changes ain't going to get us a sustainable nor a livable city tomorrow.
Question here in the middle.
Steve O'Connor, no affiliation. I've got a question for Matthew, if that's all right. Given that the ice decline in the Arctic happens 70 or 80 years ahead of schedule, is it fair to say there's a chance we may cross irreversible tipping points, such as the methane, CO2 release from the tundras, other things like that, sooner than current models might suggest?
I'm not an expertise in the methane area, but in our report, the person who wrote that section rated it as an unlikely event, but very, very high risk. Methane is stored in very high levels beneath the permafrost, basically, for those who don't know this story. And so if you melt these areas back faster, you can potentially release very high levels of methane into the atmosphere. But it's certainly a risk, and any rapid melting of that area is a great concern. There is an analysis I saw recently that rated a couple of areas in particular as of great concern. But of course there are other tipping points as well in the climate system. The Amazon rainforest was identified some years ago. It's a tremendous sink of carbon dioxide. I didn't get to present this in my slide, but we've had a really fantastic buffering of our emissions for the last 100 years by both the land surface absorbing carbon dioxide and the oceans. And any drying out of the Amazon potentially removes that sink of carbon dioxide and leaves more in the atmosphere. So there's certainly concern about these tipping points. The methane release is just one of many.
Question.
Franklin, a member of ANZUS. My question follows on from that one. Is there any, given the significant momentum behind a lot of the processes involved, is there any scientific consensus about when the game's up and we should just stop worrying because it's all inevitable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of people will feel this way. I think in the next few decades they'll get to see more and more of the changes and the facts at hand and the emissions reductions required, and maybe shrug their shoulders and say we just give up. But this is obviously not a good thing to do. Every ½ degree Celsius of warming we add to the system brings much more significant changes, and I think I know there was discussion before of 1.5 degrees as a goal. Realistically, as laudable a goal as that is, the momentum in the system says that that's virtually impossible. We need immediate action of a scale that is just not happening, and we need also luck that the climate system responds at the low end of its sort of range of scenarios, if you like. So whilst we see some goals that are good passing us by, we need to keep in mind that every single ½ degree, even a lot of people speak about 2, then 3, then 4, but really every single ½ degree of warming we lock in brings very significant increases in the impacts we have. And there's a nice book by, I think, Michael Linus, who went through each degree of warming and the sorts of changes we can have. There's 6 degrees of warming, it's called, and there's a very big difference from 1.5 to 2 degrees, hence the small island state goal of 1.5 degrees. And every ½ degree you go up, you lock in much more significant changes.
Question over here.
It's Michael Mayscout, just an AU student. With the recent events of, say, the introduction of emissions trading scheme into Parliament, as well as the Copenhagen Conference, there is evidence of governments, and some governments, pushing for ambitious cuts to greenhouse emissions. Yet, I personally get the sense there is still a significant group in the general population who do not have confidence in the climate change science. I guess from anyone who wants to comment, what would you like seen done by federal governments in terms of getting climate change science understanding into sort of homes and giving that confidence just to the general public?
Hi, can you hear? Just a student, can I challenge that? There is no such thing as just any human. A student is a very important person. You'll change the world. Look, I think we've actually got to look beyond the scientists. I think they've given us the information. Scientists actually analyse, do things and all the rest, but apart from that and a few others. But they were generally not great communicators. what we actually need. Generally, I mean, let's face it, if they were, we'd be all out there really at the front doing what we're supposed to do to keep our temperatures down. So I think what we've got to do is link. We've got to get our artists involved. Artists actually help us see an alternative reality. We go to the movies to escape. We go to see another world. We have, you know, the sculptures, the writers, the whole lot give us a different worldview. We need people out there in the arts, and they're starting to happen in a significant way, that will paint that picture, that we in the general community will go, oh, right, got it, let's do something. So that's my view on it.
As a former science communicator, I probably agree to some extent with Nathan. But it comes down to leadership, and really our politicians should be intelligent enough to understand the climate science. And Australia is actually leading a rearguard action on this. I mean, to some extent it's there in America, but it's not anywhere else. I mean, in Europe everyone accepts the climate science. I mean, Australia is just a backwater in this respect, and it's disgraceful, and it's disgraceful that we've got politicians up there like Nick Minchin and Steve Fielding who do not accept the science and are slowing down the whole legislative process for some action. Whatever you think of the CPRS, at least it was some action which got people to the table. And I think that what is lacking, that the problem is not with the scientists, even though, you know, a few more science communicators around would probably help. The problem is with the politicians who are not taking a lead, and that's where, I mean, Australia is going to be left behind if there is an international emissions trading scheme. And it's going to be those politicians who have dragged their feet on this issue are going to be held accountable by the Australian public one day when we're left out of that international trading scheme.
From the ANU. My question is for Jenny, and I was interested in your comments about the women at some of the meetings when you mentioned the issue of population in relation to climate change, that they didn't see the connection. And then you also mentioned that about 40 of the countries had on in their NAPA plans something about population issues. I'm sure it's population control or what. I'm curious as to whether some of those women were from those countries, and perhaps your reflections on the disconnect between those people responsible for reproduction, the women, and those people drawing policies around population in the same.
Well, while the women in the women's caucus that I was associating with were perhaps were not making the connection. I mean, it was so sort of dominant in their minds that the problem came from overconsumption in the developed world that they didn't really want to address the fact that high population growth in their own countries might be a problem. And, you know, I didn't want to force them too much into a defensive position. But at the same time, these women, particularly in Copenhagen, were really calling for arguing strongly that gender be included in the text. And it was bitterly disappointing that gender was excluded from the shared vision document at the end. And the women were calling for, they would make statements in the plenary session about calling for more women to be involved at the, in chairing meetings and in the policy making. And you know, there might have been a little bit of a disconnect between them not coming to grips with, you know, the target under MDG 5, namely universal access to contraception, but they were still wanting gender there in the text, and they were very strong about that. And I think once you've got gender, then you've got women's equality, and once you've got women's equality, well, you start getting your birth, you know, your numbers down, because you don't really achieve stabilisation of population numbers until you've got genuine gender equality. So it's a process, and I wish it were quicker, but the women are going to get there in the end.
We're running past already the scheduled finish time for the forum, so I'm just going to allow one more question over here. That'll be the last question, so go ahead.
Roland McCauley and you. My question's to Ian. You painted a picture of the UNFCCC process that was deeply flawed. And we've had the system for 20 years now, and it's been great for producing lowest common denominator agreements. Would you say it's the we're running out of time and it's the only system we've got, and how do you think we can make it workable, or is it time for a new approach?
Yeah, well, that is the 64 million question, I guess. Obviously, to get countries together to agree on an international, framework for addressing climate change is very difficult, particularly as we're talking about fossil fuels, which drives the energy of the world. So, and there are certainly particular interests that are involved in the fossil fuel industry that have a strong influence in the negotiations process. I've tried to think how it could be driven some way else, but I guess in the context of an international process, you have to recognise sovereign nations and the role that they play, and in that context, the UN is the only forum for dealing with that. I know there are movements to try and provide other forums for discussion and bringing issues forward, but I can't see how they can work unless there's some recognition of the rights of sovereign nations, and that generally is the UN. So it's a flawed process, but it's very hard to think of another process that could replace it.
Well, we've come to the end of the time for our forum, and what I'd like to do now is to ask you all to thank our panel members who clearly were not wise monkeys but really were experts. So, Matt England, Jenny Goldie, Ian Frye, Maxine Cooper and John Schneider, thank you very much.
I think there's another person I think that we should also thank for the way he ran the forum, and I think it's David Karoly himself. So thank you, David.